Okay, hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar, which is titled The Human Trafficking Risk Template, Using the HTRT as Part of Your Human Trafficking and Slavery Program. So, my name's Kate Dunbar, and today I'll be facilitating the webinar in my capacity as Chair of the HTRT Development Committee, but I also work for Ascent Compliance as a Senior Business and Human Rights Analyst. And so just a few words about myself before I get started. So in my day-to-day role, I predominantly support companies and their suppliers with their compliance and due diligence programs in relation to modern slavery and human trafficking, but also in relation to labor standards and wider business and human rights issues. And previously I've worked as an advocate and support worker for survivors of human trafficking, and I've also worked with large international NGOs as a child protection specialist in emergency contexts. So once again, thank you for joining us today. So this is the first webinar that is hosted by the HTRT, or Human Trafficking Risk Template Development Committee. And I'll be joined today by some guest speakers that I will introduce to you shortly, and they are all either members of the Development Committee or supporting the HTRT Development Committee in an advisory capacity. So a few housekeeping notes. You will be all receiving a set of this slide deck plus a recording of the webinar after the webinar. And we will make sure to keep time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session with you, with the audience. So throughout the webinar, if you have any comments or questions that you would like to submit to us as the speakers, please feel free to do so. You can do so by using the panel to the right-hand side of your screen. So let's have a look at today's agenda. So this webinar is an opportunity for me to give those of you out there who are not yet familiar with the HTRT and are not using the HTRT already to give you an overview of what the HTRT is, how it can be used, why it was developed, and who developed it. And then tomorrow we'll be releasing the latest version of the HTRT, so version 1.1.0. So this is also a good opportunity for me to sort of run through some of the key improvements that have been made to the template. And then we'll launch into our panel discussion with today's speakers. And so we'll be talking about how we've seen a shift from a greater awareness around human trafficking and slavery and supply chains, and sort of talk a little bit about how this has translated into action that companies are taking on these issues. But we'll also dive into some of the corporate challenges, the challenges that companies are facing when they're trying to establish and implement their human trafficking and slavery programs, as well as some of the benefits that companies can get by using the HTRT. And then finally, I'd like us to discuss the practicalities of using the HTRT as part of a company's anti-slavery and human trafficking program. And then we'll hopefully have a good chunk of time to answer any of your questions. And so we'll really try to keep the panel discussion as interactive as possible. Again, please feel free to submit any questions that may come up. So now I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. So first of all, Lydia Hultquist is the founder and moderator of the Silicon Valley Conflict Minerals and Human Trafficking Forum, and the forum is a member of the HTRT Development Committee. So Lydia has worked with industry-leading companies to develop programs that reduce costs, that improve production, and ensure compliance. And she has more than 20 years of supply chain experience. So Lydia has presented on conflict minerals at industry workshops. She's been featured in multiple issues of CR magazine, and she's also co-authored a number of articles on modern-day slavery, on risk management, and supply chain best practices. So Lydia, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome. And then we have Michael Littenberg. So Michael is a partner at Ropes & Gray, and Ropes & Gray is also a member of the HTRT Development Committee. And Michael specializes, among other things, in corporate finance and ongoing securities law compliance, mergers and acquisitions, venture capital transactions, and general corporate counseling. And in addition, as part of his practice, Michael advises companies on supply chain compliance, so on the SEC's conflict minerals rule, but also more broadly on responsible sourcing and corporate social responsibility. And Michael is widely viewed as a leading practitioner in this area. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us. And then,
thank you.
We have Ilya Gilman, who is an attorney and a senior consultant in Deloitte's Enterprise Risk Services Group and Conflict Minerals Advisory and Assurance Services team. So Deloitte is supporting the HTRT Development Committee in an advisory capacity. And Ilya has a number of years of professional experience supporting strategy and risk management initiatives at Fortune 500 corporations, but also federal government agencies and large-scale nonprofits. Welcome, Ilya.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's get started with an overview of the HTRT. So I know that many of you listening in today are already familiar with the HTRT and are already using it or sending it out to your suppliers. But for those of you who don't yet have that familiarity with the tool, it's a free open source template that is currently used to assist companies across all types of industries and sectors in their compliance, their disclosure, and their reporting efforts in relation to slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor in supply chains. So it's composed of a number of questions, around 20, and it gets sent out to suppliers who are then requested to complete the question set and provide supporting documentation in some cases. So depending on a supplier's answers, they will sort of commit to providing supporting documentation to support their answers. And it's in a Microsoft Excel format. It's quite similar to the conflict minerals reporting template. I know many of you will be familiar with that. So in terms of the type of information and data that the HTRT collects, this can broadly be sort of broadly based into two categories. So on the one hand, the HTRT helps companies pick up on high-level indicators of risk of human trafficking and forced labor. And on the other hand, it picks up on indicators of potential compliance or potential non-compliance with the anti-human trafficking legislation that is out there today. So why was the HTRT developed? Well, for a number of years now, we've seen an increase in focus and awareness on slavery and human trafficking in supply chains. And this has in turn resulted in new or increased regulations and laws around anti-human trafficking, around human trafficking and slavery in supply chains. And it's also this has been coupled with sort of greater NGO scrutiny, more and more media investigations around this issue. And I think it's fair to say just a sort of general increase in expectations of investor and consumer expectations when it comes to the steps that the companies need to be taking to prevent this human rights violation from occurring in their supply chains. So as a result, there are many companies out there today who have been looking for a standard human trafficking supplier risk compliance assessment survey for several reasons. And the first one, I think, is really to sort of avoid overwhelming suppliers. So to date, we've found as the Development Committee that suppliers are being sort of sent diverse types of assessment questionnaires that are asking different questions and for different types of data, which can be very overwhelming for suppliers and is not the best way of doing things. So on the one hand, you know, the HTRT has been developed to avoid overwhelming suppliers in this way and to have a standardized data collection and sharing process. Standardization is, you know, one of the first steps in sort of being able to really continuously track progress that a company is making, benchmark against what others are doing, etc. And then I was earlier referring to the conflict minerals reporting template. It's fair to say that the HTRT was inspired by the conflict minerals reporting template, and so it does look quite similar, which we feel will greatly help in terms of ensuring sort of high response rates from suppliers. So who developed the HTRT? Well, it started off with a consortium of corporations, of legal and audit firms, and various industry and other stakeholders coming together sort of shape this tool. And since then, a more formalized development committee has been established, and that development committee is today responsible for the annual review of the HTRT. So this is not an exhaustive list of the development committee members. But as you can see on this slide, it includes academics such as the University of Sheffield. We also have companies such as Baker Hughes, service providers like Ropes & Gray, Ascent and Deloitte, and ECD Compliance and others. So the Development Committee is responsible for maintaining, reviewing and revising the template to ensure that it retains its value, its relevance and its effectiveness. And as the Development Committee, we strive to have sort of a good balance in terms of representation of the different stakeholders on the committee. So we want to have good balance between industry stakeholders and non-industry stakeholders. So how can companies use the HTRT and how are companies already using the HT? Well, primarily it is used on an annual basis as part of a company's internal efforts to assess risk within the supply chain. And we have found that most of the companies that have downloaded the HTRT and that are using this and sending this out to their suppliers tend to be sort of large companies with global complex supply chains, often, you know, with suppliers in the thousands. So it's really a sort of, on the one hand, a risk screening tool that helps companies sort of boil down the ocean so that they can better determine if and where they need to take further due diligence actions and how they can prioritize these actions in order to mitigate risk or ensure compliance within their supply chain. And as I was mentioning earlier, it's also a good tool to track supplier progress and engagement over time. So the HTRT is a relatively new tool. It came out last year, but already we're seeing companies committing to using it over time so that they are able to compare data from one year to the next, track supplier progress, and sort of monitor and evaluate the benefits and impact of them working with their suppliers on risk mitigation and what impact that has had in terms of a supplier being able to mitigate and minimize risk over time. And last but not least, companies are using the HTRT to feed into public disclosures and reporting efforts. So to give you an example, the UK Modern Slavery Act requires companies in scope to disclose the efforts that they're taking in terms of trying to eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking from their supply chains. So companies can use the data that they're collecting with the HTRT to sort of create more robust disclosures. And on the other hand, just by using the HTRT itself, this is a risk assessment tool and a data collection tool. So companies can then talk about this as part of the wider due diligence program and process that they will have in place to respond to issues like slavery and human trafficking. So the HTRT's newest version, version 1.1.0, will be available tomorrow at the website htrt.org for download. So I encourage you to visit the website tomorrow where you'll be able to download the newest version. And this is just to give you a sort of a quick overview of what the template looks like. It has several tabs. This is the declaration tab that we're seeing right now. And this is a good opportunity for me to quickly run through some of the key improvements that have been made by the Development Committee as part of the latest review of the HTRT. So most of the improvements have been made to the declaration tab itself, which is the one that is completed by suppliers. And I'd say that the biggest change is sort of the changes that have been made to strengthen questions and strengthen language so that the template better picks up or has a better assessment of risk and also a better assessment of potential compliance and non-compliance with relevant legislation. So questions around policy, around risk identification and risk management, and around training and public disclosure have been strengthened to better capture the data that companies need to be collecting. We've also made some functionality improvements, so we've fixed some of the dependency errors that were there, and we've added a comment field because we felt it was important for suppliers, for the HTRT to be, an opportunity also for suppliers to dialogue with their customers and to be able to provide sort of more detailed explanations and provide feedback. The review tab has been improved, so hopefully this will enable suppliers to get a better overview of whether they have adequately completed the template. And we've also improved the messaging and modified some of the language in the introduction tab. And one change we've made there is to include the term slavery. So previously we were predominantly talking about human trafficking and forced labor. Now these are all terms that are used interchangeably most of the time, but we felt that given the prevalence of the word slavery and modern slavery, including in some of today's legislation, we wanted to make sure that that was captured by the HTRT. And then the glossary has also been updated. We now have improved and clearer definitions that will again hopefully help suppliers better understand the template and sort of be able to better complete it. So that's it in terms of an overview of the HTRT and the key improvements. Now I'd like us to jump into the panel discussion. So Ilya, Michael, Lydia, once again, welcome and thank you for joining me today. So I was thinking we could start off with a discussion around the shift that I think we've all seen from, human trafficking and slavery has become quite a hot topic, a high-profile issue when it comes to, what's happening in supply chains. So we've seen sort of a rise in awareness around this topic, and I'd like us to talk about that shift and also how this greater awareness is translating into further corporate action on slavery and human trafficking. And Ilya, I was thinking we could start with you. So, I mean, you support companies day to day with their compliance and risk management activities. And so in recent years, as I was just saying, I've seen this shift. Now, would you agree with that? Have you seen a shift towards greater corporate awareness of and focus on slavery and human trafficking in supply chains? And if yes, what do you attribute this shift to?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I have definitely seen this shift, and I think companies have always had an interest in understanding their supply chain as well as their supplier base for a lot of practical reasons, primarily being around the negotiation of deals with their suppliers, the reduction of costs, and ultimately the effect on that bottom line. What I've really seen in the last handful or couple of years is the recognition that supply chain transparency, is important, and that there's a multitude of risk within the supply chain, which includes the risk of slavery as well as human trafficking. And I'd really attribute this to three key drivers. The first really being compliance-driven. There has been a myriad of regulations, starting with conflict minerals, as well as the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, that has really driven awareness in human trafficking within the supply chain. I'll leave the regulatory discussion to Michael Lindberg, who is the sitting attorney on the panel, but I did want to point that out, that companies are certainly worried about compliance. The second driver of awareness comes from a brand and reputation standpoint, and that companies have this understanding that if there is any incidence of human trafficking within their organization or within their supply chain, ultimately it's going to go back to that company. Ultimately, that might reduce goodwill. It's going to harm the company's brand, their reputation. And given the social media culture we really live in, where information travels so quickly, anything that happens specifically on a topic such as human trafficking, it's really going to affect the company's brand and their license to operate. So I'd really say that's the second key driver. And the third driver is it's really evolving stakeholder expectation. And when I talk about stakeholders, I'm thinking of anyone, whether it's a customer, an NGO, or a shareholder, that have had different views on what's important to them, on what issues they care about, and what they demand from the organizations that they're involved with. One of those issues is human trafficking. And again, as I mentioned, it's important for those stakeholders, both at the organizational level, but also within the supply chain or the extended enterprise, wherever that company is doing business. So these companies really need to be responsive to their stakeholders, and thus they're becoming more and more aware of these issues, including human trafficking. We work with clients that come to us due to a number of reasons, but I would say they're split among these three groups. We have a group of clients that say, hey, regulation has come out. What do we have to do to meet the standards of this regulation when it's regarding human trafficking with the supply chain? Others see company X is being sued, or we just saw a news story that impacted a company's brand. Can you help us so this doesn't happen to us? How can we make sure we mitigate the risk of human trafficking in our supply chain so we don't have a hit to our brand, to our reputation? And finally, we have a group of companies that come to us and say, our stakeholders, our customers, our shareholders are demanding that we implement supply chain transparency, including transparency as far as our efforts around human trafficking. Can you help us with this? And we work with our clients to really solve these issues that are driven by a myriad of things.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really insightful sort of overview to some of the different drivers that I have also definitely been seeing and been discussing with different companies. And Lydia, is this a shift that you've also witnessed in your work? And I'm thinking particularly, you know, what your involvement with the Silicon Valley and the Conflict Minerals and Human Trafficking Forum. Could you speak to that a little bit as well, please?
Yes, and I think Ilya you hit that spot on. Your 3 points. You know, regulatory, compliance, you know, brand, and stakeholder shareholder engagement. So we're seeing that same shift as well. You know, I think it's again started with conflict minerals, transparency within the supply chain, and now this is shifting to the modern slavery, human trafficking. And you know, within the forum, we get lots of questions. The same folks that were managing their conflict minerals programs are now managing this piece of it. And it seems very deja vu. It's like, wow, here we are again, you know. And instead of kind of reinventing the wheel, you know, what did we learn from conflict minerals and how we manage that? So putting some of the same practices as far as, you know, how conflict minerals programs were managed, we're using a lot of the same, you know, logic there with managing this program as well. And so definitely seeing that shift in that direction.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting to see, you know, the issue of conflict minerals coming up again and again as sort of something that companies have hopefully very much learnt from and are now able to sort of apply lessons learned and good practice from conflict minerals to slavery and human trafficking. And perhaps we can talk more about that in a little while. Michael, I mean, Ilya did a great job sort of summarizing the different drivers. Is there anything you want to add? I mean, from a legal perspective, do you believe that regulations have been the #1 driver for this increased awareness?
I think that's right. I mean, certainly as I think, Ilya, did a very good job highlighting, and as Lydia also highlighted, there have been many other drivers, but, I do think the reality is, for most companies, the biggest driver or impetus to change is regulation. And in this area, I do think that that's been the case. And, Ilya ticked off some of those regulations, but, I think, what's been, striking about this particular area is just the number of different regulations that are out there that have been enacted, that are proposed, voluntary codes of conduct, and I'll talk briefly about just a couple of those. But, it is a big differentiator from the world of conflict minerals, where people have, really been dealing with one particular regulation, a fairly narrowly tailored regulation. And yes, we're going to have an EU regulation that's going to take effect in 2021, but that's also very narrowly tailored. I think what makes, human trafficking or modern slavery a much harder issue for companies to deal with is the regulations tend to be much more broadly written, and also it's a very different type of issue. It's prevalent in a lot more countries. It's prevalent in a lot of industries and a lot of supply chains. It's much harder for companies to get their arms around. And there's also many, many more NGOs focused on this issue than there are on conflict minerals. And, whether that's some of the global NGOs, that's NGOs that are focused more at the national level, NGOs that are more grassroots and are locally focused, some that are focused on only specific populations within specific countries or regions or specific industries. So it's a much more complicated patchwork for companies to deal with. So in terms of, some of the regulations, and, I know on, other programs I've done with Kate, there's this slide I like to use, which we don't have today, but which, just kind of has on one page, shows the patchwork of the different regulations in this area. And, they really kind of fall into 3 buckets. There's the regulations that are disclosure only, so things like the UK Modern Slavery Act, the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act that Ilya mentioned. But we also do see prescriptive regulations in this area, so things like the U.S. Federal Acquisition Regulation on Anti-Human Trafficking, the new French Corporate Duty of Vigilance Law that's taking effect soon. But then there's also proposed regulations. So there's it's a somewhat different issue, but it's a related issue. There's a child labor law in the Netherlands that's very far along in the process. Australia, the parliament there has opened an inquiry concerning the adoption of national modern slavery legislation, so similar to the UK Modern Slavery Act. In the United States, just in the last couple weeks, the End Banking for Human Trafficking Act was proposed. And on the voluntary side, most recently the Welsh Code of Practice for Ethical Employment and Supply Chains was adopted by the Welsh government, and that's already something that we're seeing some of our clients getting pressure to adopt for various reasons. So, a lot of kind of different stuff here, some which is disclosure only, some of which is prescriptive, and then also trade-based legislation like the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act in the U.S., which eliminated the consumptive demand exception from the Tariff Act. That was something that took effect last year, and that's also having implications for companies in different industries with different supply chains, on the goods that they're seeking to import into the United States. So, so certainly, regulation is a big driver in this area, and I think over time we're going to see more of it, certainly not less.
Thanks, Michael. And certainly, I mean, based on what you're all saying, there's so much out there, and as you say, Michael, so many sort of different buckets of legislation, and not just legislation, also looking at sort of increased expectations from various stakeholders. In a way, although different companies will have different drivers, so some companies will be driven by, compliance requirements, and others will be driven by brand, reputation, I'm seeing these companies all sort of merge towards the same path, which is a path that leads them to increased due diligence as opposed to just focusing on compliance. So, for instance, under the UK Modern Slavery Act or the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, compliance is not about necessarily due diligence, it's about disclosure and transparency. But companies that are now under all these pressures that we've just mentioned are much more likely to want to establish risk assessment, risk mitigation, and other due diligence activities as part of their compliance program, which I think is very interesting, and also one of the reasons why the HTRT was developed in the first place. So we'll move on to the second discussion topic of our panel discussion, which is sort of more around the challenges that companies are facing today and some of the benefits of using the HTRT. So Lydia, you've been working with companies primarily in the tech sector for a long time now, and in your view, what are some of the key challenges that companies face in establishing and implementing their slavery and human trafficking programs, and how do you think the HTRT can help them with some of these challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things I hear a lot is resources, are an issue. I'm one person, two people managing this, and it's a lot of information that I need to gather, and how do I manage in an efficient way. And so that's one. One is management buy-in, and advocating this to management and confirming that they're on board with this. And so something like the HTRT, again, with gathering this information, is something that a standard template that would make it very easy for suppliers to fill out and gather this information would be very helpful.
Thanks. And Ilya, from your perspective, are there any other benefits that you see for companies in using, standard risk and compliance data collection templates such as the HTRT?
Yeah, Lydia, you definitely brought up some great points as far as resources and standardization, and I think that having a uniform template that's being used by various companies will definitely help with the quality of data that suppliers are being provided. And by that, what I mean is, once suppliers have seen the template, they're trained on the template, they better understand the template as well as the questions that are being asked, the information that they provide is higher quality and ultimately more reliable. Thus, you as a company could trust that information and use it in a meaningful way. if every company was asking the same question in a myriad of ways, it's potential that suppliers would get confused, provide the wrong information, and ultimately the information would not be very useful or reliable to the organization. So the HTRT is great that it provides that uniform template that suppliers understand and can provide the company reliable information. With all that being said, I would be remiss to state that, that the HTRT, from my perspective, is a great starting point as far as a risk assessment tool. Companies can use it alongside other data that they have to understand the risk of human trafficking within their supply chain. So if they have other data, whether it's product information, geographic information, they could use this along with the responses to the HTRT to really understand what is the risk of human trafficking in the supply chain, which suppliers pose the most risk to us, and what are the subsequent steps we as a company need to take from a due diligence perspective. And I think that the HTRT can really point companies in the right direction. Do we need to do anything? Do we need to potentially conduct interviews? Do we need to actually go audit the supplier? And I think that starting point and the HTRT being used as a risk assessment tool is invaluable to companies.
Thanks, Ilya. And absolutely, I mean, I agree. I see the HTRT as being a part of a wider puzzle. So it supports in all the ways that were outlined previously, but it really needs to fit into sort of a wider program. And just as important as, understanding where the risk is, then the next step is, what do we do with this information that we now have? And I liked your point about data triangulation. I think the more companies are able to sort of leverage different data points and different sources of information, the better they'll be able to sort of paint a picture of what needs to change within their supply chain. And I mean, I might add to, you've talked about resources and standardization, improving quality of data, etc. I might also add that that using the HTRT can be interesting in terms of benchmarking activities. I mean, in a lot of conversations that I have with companies, the question pops up of, what are my peers doing? What are other people doing, other companies doing? And how do my efforts as a company or our efforts as a company compare to what is being done? And certainly benchmarking initiatives around slavery and human trafficking, such as the ones that have been conducted by Know the Chain recently, have received a lot of attention because I think that's in high demand. And so by using the HTRT and sort of collecting the same type of data year after year, that's a good way of sort of tracking progress, comparing progress, and also I think clarifying what the expectations are from suppliers. So, sort of increasing supplier engagement and having a dialogue with a supplier so that they really understand, why this is important to their customer, what types of data they're going to be asked for again next year. And so it makes it a little bit easier for suppliers to know what to work on and what to sort of progress towards. And Michael, again, from more the compliance and regulatory perspective, how does the HTRT support companies practically with compliance to specific anti-human trafficking and slavery requirements?
Sure. So, as we've alluded to, a lot of the regulations in this area are disclosure only, and they give companies a lot of flexibility in terms of what they do. So, for example, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, so they don't necessarily require you to do anything, but they require you to talk about what you do, which of course means that, that pushes companies to what the UK calls a race to the top. With that said, though, not all regulations are structured this way, and in particular, one regulation that a lot of companies are dealing with, not only in the U.S. but outside the U.S., and something we're working with a lot of people on, is the Federal Acquisition Regulation Anti-Human Trafficking Rule, and that took effect in March 2015, but it only applies to new federal contracts after that date. So the practical reality is for a lot of companies with longer-term federal contracts, really this one's just starting to roll in. Even though there is flexibility of approach required under the FAR regulation, it is much more prescriptive than the other regulations in this area. So it prohibits specific activities that are deemed to constitute modern slavery for purposes of the Act. There's 9 different activities. It also requires companies to take specific compliance measures. You have to have a compliance plan in place. You have to get certifications, and then for purposes of the certifications, those are predicated on having to do due diligence. There's a due diligence acknowledgement in the certification itself. So, I think that in addition to, being valuable for all of the other reasons that Lydia and Ilya and Kate have cited, the HTRT, one of the things I do like about it is that it is intended to also facilitate compliance with the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the compliance plan requirements and the certification requirements. So it's certainly, very helpful in that regard for companies that do have a more prescriptive regulation that they need to comply with. And it's not only helpful for the prime contractors in their dealings with the federal government, but I think it also can be very helpful for the primes in their dealing with subcontractors, because, getting back to the point made earlier about standardization, I think the more people that are talking the same language, the more it does reduce compliance costs and increase, increase the results for surveys and the like for everybody.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so we'll move on to the third section, third part of our panel discussion, where I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the practical steps that kind of fit around the HTRT and the use of the HTRT within a company's due diligence and compliance program. So this question is really for all of you. You all have such diverse experience, and I'm sure you have points to add to this question. So there are many companies out there who are already using the HTRT as part of their wider compliance and due diligence programs, and there are probably many companies out there that are interested or thinking about starting to use the HTRT. So as we said previously, the HTRT is just a piece of the puzzle. So there are other due diligence and practical activities and steps that need to be occurring beyond sending out the HTRT if companies want to, really ensure compliance and risk mitigation. So based on all of your experience, what are the practical steps that you would suggest companies take if they really want to, on the one hand, maximize the benefits of using this template, and on the other hand, ensure continuous improvement year after year? And Lydia, maybe we'll start with you. Earlier you were referring to conflict minerals and the sort of lessons learned from that. Is there anything that you can think of that sort of activities that needs to be happening at the same time or around the send out of the HTRT to sort of maximize a company's benefits of using this?
Yes, one of the things with conflict minerals, I think training initially, when ruling first came out, and I remember this was new to a lot of suppliers. So there was a piece of the training, educating them what this is about, why this is important to our company, that we track this and monitor this. Same here. There's a reason we're doing this. We're not sending this out to you just because we have nothing better to do. There's a reason behind this, and I think it's important to send a clear message. I've seen this with companies where there's sometimes a letter included from, say, a VP of supply chain, someone from the legal management team, standing behind this is why we're doing that. And I can't stress that enough. Folks like to understand why they're doing this, and I think if it's very clear the reason for doing that helps in your supplier engagement. Anytime you can reach out to the supply chain, or anything that allows an engagement with your supply chain to collect information, review, and assess, really is a step in the right direction.
Thanks. Yeah. So I mean, I would definitely agree with you in terms of training, of supplier engagement. Those are key. And what you were mentioning about, maybe having a letter signed by a VP of supply chain or procurement or whoever that may be, sort of points to the importance of maybe leveraging existing relations that you have between, within your own company and with your suppliers. Ilya, would you like to add to what Lydia has said?
Sure. Yeah, Lydia, those were all great points, and I would echo them all, specifically around the training and education and providing suppliers the why, or the purpose of why they're doing this. We learned in our experience working on conflict minerals with a number of clients is once the supplier understood that there was a regulatory mandate, that this was part of a SEC disclosure or a disclosure that the company was making in another means, they were much more willing to be an active participant with conflict minerals. And I think there's certainly a lot of carryover when looking at human trafficking with the supply chain. Another item that I would like to discuss a little bit is really having high-level buy-in into the HTRT and making sure that there's a tone set from the top as far as senior leadership, that this is an important endeavor, and understanding this information, reporting on this information is important to the company and is valuable to the company. You know, ultimately, we've worked with companies, at least in the conflict mineral space, where that message wasn't as prominent, and thus the information collected and the work done wasn't as great. Other companies that understood the value of supply chain transparency really took greater initiatives, conducted better supply chain due diligence, and it ultimately led to efficiencies in areas that they would have never thought, whether that be cost reductions and effect on the bottom line or risk mitigation. They were able to really take conflict minerals and now starting to take the information gathered from human trafficking and really gain efficiencies. So that's certainly important. And the last thing I think that's also important from a practical standpoint is thinking about how to integrate human trafficking and this whole disclosure process into broader supply chain transparency, rather than it being a standalone program or activity. Really thinking about how does this fit with conflict minerals, how does this fit with potentially some other product integrity regulations, whether that's REACH or ROS or other things, and seeing how can you integrate this into broader supply chain transparency so that it really isn't a standalone program, but rather part of a holistic experience where you are looking into your suppliers and evaluating them on a number of factors, one of which is human trafficking within the supply chain.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, I found certainly in my work here to send compliance that is something that's coming up more and more. So there are companies that we work with who are leveraging the HTRT, who are using that, who have sort of their slavery and human trafficking program. But more and more we're having discussions with companies around exactly what you're saying, Ilya, about integrating that into a wider program. So, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of companies ask questions around, you know, what can our sort of broader human rights program look like? And Michael, perhaps you can touch on this a little bit. I mean, you were mentioning earlier that there are a number of laws out there that are relevant to slavery and human trafficking in supply chains, but aren't restricted to that. So, you know, sort of human rights, due diligence or disclosure laws. And so I don't know, Michael, if you want to add anything on that, or if you have anything to add in terms of, you know, what other steps companies should be taking to sort of maximize the benefits of the HTRT or ensure continuous improvement.
Sure. Well, you've done enough webinars with me. You know I always have something I can comment on. So, or at least I'll make it up if I don't, right? So, look, I agree with you know what everybody has said about, you know, I think, you know, it's important to, you know, look at this, you know, in the bigger picture of, you know, compliance and risk, and, you know, certainly, you know, where you can, you know, integrate this with other things, whether it's conflict minerals, whether it's, you know, REACH and ROS. You know, what we're also, you know, seeing companies trying to do, especially with anti-human trafficking, because it is somewhat of a, it's related in that it's supply chain, but it's also, you know, somewhat of a different animal from conflict minerals and from REACH and ROS from a risk perspective. We're seeing a lot of clients trying to integrate their approach on modern slavery with the due diligence that they do around anti-money laundering, that they do around OFAC, that they do around anti-boycott issues, because not all of the time, but often where there's one of these issues, there can be more than one of them. And, and certainly for some companies, these issues are very far removed in their supply chain. So it's a little harder to integrate those programs, but for other companies, the supply chains are much more compressed, and there's more pressure on trying to, integrate it with some of the anti-bribery, anti-corruption legislation, and compliance initiatives and requirements that people have. And it's not easy. There's no one way to do it. Every company is different, and because everybody is trying to figure out how to integrate all of this stuff. I think it's going to be a multi-year process at the earliest for companies. It's not something that's all going to come together all at once, and I think companies need to, be mindful of that. That there needs to be, I think, a lot of baby steps and down the path of integrating compliance around these issues. And I will mention also that increasingly we're seeing that NGOs are starting to think about a lot of these issues together, right? So rather than looking at them in their own silos, just like companies are trying to integrate this, so are the NGOs when they're thinking about risk profiles around companies, as are institutional investors. So we're seeing a lot of new metrics coming out that on the investor side that are also putting together risk profiles on companies, based on a whole host of, different ESG indicators. A couple of other things I'll just mention to, piggyback on a few other things that people were talking about. I think as companies think about compliance around these issues, I think it's important to, step back before you rush headlong into compliance and think about, well, what are the risks, as it relates to modern slavery that are in your business and your supply chain, because depending upon what those risks are, I think that's going to result in, different sorts of compliance programs at different companies, in some cases dramatically different programs. And I think you have to think about, as a company, as part of that also, where does this fit into the broader risk profile? Also, another thing which I think you have to take into account, and this is a hard one for companies, is it's more of a philosophical conversation, but where do you want to be as a company? So to speak, where do you want to be when you grow up, right? Because different companies have different views on where they want to be on these sorts of issues, and what their risk tolerance is based on all of those different factors we were talking about at the beginning of the program. And then finally, I think what's really important is you have to focus on, so how do you use this information? I think one of the things that happened with the conflict minerals rule, because it was a somewhat prescriptive rule, there were very specific reporting requirements around it. At a lot of companies, the exercise was collecting data for the sake of collecting data and reporting it out because you were required to report it out. And certainly, I think leading companies, they've looked at that data, they figured out how to use it to make their companies better, to reduce risk, to reduce cost. But I think it's important as you're collecting data around human trafficking, to figure out what you're going to use the data for, because ultimately it's not about collecting the data, it's about how the data benefits your business. So it's, you have to have a goal, in mind with how you're going to use this stuff.
Thanks, absolutely, and it sort of brings to mind one of the requested or recommended topic areas for disclosure within the UK Modern Slavery Act around sort of having KPIs, key performance indicators, and I think it fits neatly into what you're saying in terms of companies needing to think about how they're going to use the data and how that fits into where they want to get to, year after year, where they want to be. And also, Michael, you were talking about baby steps and how, this is a very complex endeavor. It's going to take time. And I agree with that. And I think that brings up the point of, where in the supply chain are we looking at right now? And in the context of the HTRT and talking about leveraging the HTRT as part of a company's due diligence and compliance programs, at this point in time we're often talking about companies sending the HTRT to their tier 1 suppliers, which is the starting point, which is where we need to start things, and it's a very important part of the due diligence compliance process. But I think the expectation from many fronts is going to be that it doesn't stop there. I mean, we know that slavery and human trafficking are issues that tend to occur further upstream in the supply chain. So I expect that year after year, companies will be hopefully trying to progress up the supply chain to understand, what the risks are further and further away from where they are standing within the supply chain, and the HTRT hopefully can be leveraged in that way as well. So maybe the first year or couple of years, companies will be sending it out to their tier 1 suppliers, and then we'll go further. Okay, so we're coming up to 10 minutes to 2, which is perfect because we have 10 minutes left for questions and answers from the audience. So I am now going to have a quick look at the questions that we've received from our audience, and I'll be right back in just a quick minute with our questions. Okay, so there's one here that's I find very interesting and very difficult to answer. The question is, are there any effective studies that show that these regulatory compliance efforts by companies are indeed reducing human trafficking and slavery to any significant amount? That's $1 million question. I mean, it's incredibly hard, I think, to be able to show, for companies to show, even for NGOs to show, for the media to show, that there is a direct impact, a direct link between increased regulations and increased efforts and a reduction in the number of instances of slavery, human trafficking and forced labor. And I think a similar issue has come up with conflict minerals, sort of making that link and proving that it has an impact. I have no doubt that it does and that it will have an impact. I think it's quite early on to be able to say, that these regulatory compliance efforts are having a direct impact on reducing the incidence of slavery and human trafficking. But I think what we can say is, we know there is a lot of research out there that points to the known indicators of slavery and human trafficking. So some of the key indicators that slavery and human trafficking may be taking place or is more likely to take place within supply chains are things like charging recruitment fees, like poor working conditions, like low wages, etc. So as companies sort of embark on this journey to mitigate risk, they will also ideally be looking at these issues, and some of these issues are addressed within the HTRT. So, avoiding recruitment fees, improving working conditions, ensuring fair labor standards for workers, all contribute to decreasing the risk of human trafficking and slavery in supply chains. Lydia, Ilya, Michael, would you like to add to that question? I'll just rephrase it again. So, is there any sort of tangible evidence that these efforts, compliance or due diligence efforts, are in fact reducing human trafficking and slavery?
So yeah, if you want, I can jump in there on that. I was glad you answered it to start with before you told us what the question was, and you said it was a hard one. I was kind of hoping you were going to do it, or at least not directed to me. This is a conversation that comes up all the time. Kate, as you pointed out, I mean, this is very controversial around the conflict minerals rule, and I think it's hard because and I don't think we're going to really see a whole lot of great empirical data out there anytime soon, because first the statistics on even what the incidence of human trafficking or modern slavery is are all over the place. I mean, on the low end, you see statistics saying 20 million people. On the high end, you see statistics of 60 million or more people. So it's hard to even define what the issue is, and I think for individual companies, it's even harder to, a lot of times measure, measure around these things. I mean, you can measure, around, tactical things, or, about, so, you went out to your suppliers, how many suppliers filled out questionnaires, how many people attended training. But, if you have a successful program, and you're otherwise successful in your compliance efforts, you'll never wind up having a serious issue around modern slavery in your supply chain, right? So it's, but you can never prove that the absence of having an incidence was because of your compliance program, right? So it's always a hard one. So I think, to a point that, Ilya was making earlier, around conflict minerals, is that, you know, I think it's important to try to look for, you know, collateral benefits where you can, so how do you use information to potentially, you know, tighten up the supply chain, you know, and enhance supplier performance on other sorts of issues, you know, things that are, you know, more tangible from a compliance standpoint where you can actually, you know, save money or, you know, enhance performance in other areas.
Thanks. We've only got a few more minutes left, and I know that you know, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I just want to move on to another interesting question. Is the question is, are the studies showing a correlation between human trafficking and bribery and corruption? So I mean, I can definitely send links to, you know, relevant resources and studies out there, but I would say that yes, I mean, the prevalence of corruption is known to increase the risk of human trafficking. And if we step back from just looking at supply chains for a minute and we look at human trafficking more broadly, there are three, what we call the 3 Ps when we're talking about responding to human trafficking, and those: protection and prosecution. And so if you imagine in a country or a context where there are high levels of corruption, then prevention, protection, and prosecution are less likely to occur or to occur effectively. And if I would refer you to the US State Department's Trafficking in Persons annual reports, where every single country around the world is ranked according to their efforts to prevent and respond to human trafficking, and also ranked based on the prevalence of human trafficking in those countries. So the issue of corruption does come up a lot. And now to bring that back to supply chains and to companies and their efforts, you know, it comes back to what Ilya was saying earlier about the importance of having sort of integrated programs. So, you know, if a company is looking at having a human trafficking or an anti-human trafficking and slavery program, it would be very sort of interesting to connect that with anti-bribery and anti-corruption efforts that are ongoing. Did anyone else want to add to that question?
Yeah, so this is Ilya, and I would certainly echo that, and that is one of the things we certainly work on with our clients, is really thinking about those correlations in certain instances, and understanding if there is one indicator, is it a proxy for another indicator, and in this instance, as you mentioned, anti-corruption or anti-bribery being correlated with human trafficking. And that's where you can use data you've received to really evaluate a supplier more holistically and think about, well, okay, there's a potential for human trafficking. Are there potential other issues with the supplier? Is this someone we need to be moving away from? Is this someone we need to be monitoring more closely? And you can ultimately monitor that supplier and assess them in a more holistic manner.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have a few more questions, but we're coming up to 2 minutes to the hour, and I want to make sure that we stay on time and respect people's schedules. So before we leave, I just want to tell you a little bit about some upcoming events and resources. So tomorrow is the date for the release of the newest version of the HTRT template, so it's version 1.1.0, and it'll be available at htrt.org. It's a free open source template. You can download it very easily. And also on the website you'll find an FAQ document and a supplier guide. So the supplier guide is particularly useful for companies who are having to complete the HTRT, so it'll tell you more about how to do so, you know, what types of supporting document you might want to provide and send back to your customer, and those will be available on the HTRT website as well. Also, just an FYI, you know, this is the first of many HTRT hosted webinars to come, and we'll be sending dates to you, and they'll be on the website as soon as they're confirmed. And then in Q3, Q4, we will be, as the Development Committee, releasing risk scoring guidance. And this is important because I didn't mention earlier, but the template doesn't have integrated risk scoring. And there's good reason for that. Although we understand that many companies out there will be looking for guidance on how to interpret the results of the data that they're getting from suppliers, we wanted to allow flexibility for different companies to assess and prioritize different information differently, depending, for instance, on the internal policies that you might have as a company, on different priorities that you have, etc. Nonetheless, we will be releasing risk scoring guidance that companies can use to assess the results and the data that they're collecting from suppliers. And then, last but not least, we have one of the development committee members will be leading or facilitating an HTRT panel at the upcoming Marcus Evans conference. It's the 5th Responsible Sourcing and Supply Chain Compliance Conference, and I believe it will be in Chicago at the end of next month. So if you're in Chicago or planning to go to Marcus Evans, then hopefully you'll be able to join that panel discussion. So I want to thank you all so much for attending today's webinar, and I really want to thank Lydia, Michael and Ilya for a fantastically interesting discussion. Thanks so much for being available today, and I look forward to our next HTRT webinar. And for those of you who submitted questions that we have not had time to answer, we'll definitely get back to you individually by email within the next couple of days. Thank you.